You guys can get along the side there. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're holding this press conference today really to bring people up to date. I know there's still questions about what is going on in East Palestine. We've tried throughout this to continue to inform the public, everyone, but most particularly the people who are directly affected. So today I brought many members of our team together to talk about the current monitoring that's underway, and to really answer any outstanding questions that may still be out there. Today I have experts from the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, the Ohio Department of Health, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, the Ohio Department of Agriculture, Ohio Department of Public Safety, the Ohio Emergency Management Agency, the Ohio Department of Transportation, and the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. They're all in the room with me today. Let me go back to February 3rd, 8:55 p.m. when the train wreck occurred. While traveling through East Palestine on Friday night, February 3rd, a north southern train derailed, causing a massive fire. Around 50 railroad cars were impacted by the crash, including 10 that were hauling hazardous materials. In addition to the fire, there was also serious environmental concerns. U.S. EPA and the Ohio EPA worked to slow the flow of contaminated water, while firefighters worked to extinguish the blaze. By that Sunday, 2 days later, concerns began to arise in regard to the temperature in one of the cars. I was on a conference call that night around 7:30 when that information was first given to me. Based on the conversations that I was hearing and information, it was clear that more assistance was needed in East Palestine, and so I activated the Ohio National Guard to go there, which they did very, very quickly. I was also informed on that call about the car where the temperature was described as very volatile, and at that moment was in fact rising. The fear was that this car might explode, sending deadly shrapnel in all directions. The next morning, I traveled to East Palestine. I met with those on the ground, those who had been working, those who represented the railroad, as well as the federal government. It was clear at that point that we were faced with two bad options. One option was to do nothing and wait for the car to explode. I had a discussion with the representatives of the railroad, an extended discussion. I brought Pennsylvania Governor Shapiro in that through my cell phone, and we went back and forth for a couple hours, trying to just weigh the risk, one versus the other. The risk of the car exploding was described to me as high, high probability that it could explode. And when I pressed everyone to give me the information about, and also give Governor Shapiro the information, because he was on the cell phone listening and asking questions, it came back that the concern was that this would be a catastrophic, what was described as a catastrophic explosion of the car. which would result in shrapnel going out up to close to a mile. We also looked at what the danger was from a controlled release, which is what the railroad felt should be done. Again, Governor Shapiro and I spent considerable time, up to about 2 hours, as I recall, asking a lot of questions about how that would take place. We had the benefit of the Ohio National Guard that had done a modeling exercise. They did that in conjunction with the U.S. Defense Department, who gave them some additional information and help in regard to the modeling. The modeling was then produced into a map I believe that we showed everyone that day when we had our press conference. There was a red area that they described as the likelihood of death within that red area would be very high. There was an area outside that, the yellow area, where they also described it would be very dangerous to be there, but not quite as dangerous as it was within the red area. We then made the decision to go ahead with the second option, which was the controlled release. As that was being prepared to be done, we sent back law enforcement into those zones, the red zone and the yellow zone, for the third time to literally knock on doors. And they described how they did it to me. They did it in very loud, did everything they could do to get, if there's anyone left in that house, to get their attention to come out. That was the third time that those houses, I believe, had been contacted. The individuals in those houses had been contacted. The controlled release did in fact occur. It was, to my understanding, delayed a little bit. There was actually, when we, at 3 o'clock, release was supposed to be at 3:30. We wanted to get everybody out of there. We had members of the Guard and the patrol and others who had the area cordoned off. We told them to leave there at 3 o'clock. Unfortunately, there's a couple cars that came in, and they had to go get them out of that impacted area, or what would be an impacted area. So the release occurred, as I recall, about 4:15, 4:20, and we were monitoring the air outside that area, and the air continued to be good. Fast forward to the time when we opened it back up a couple of days later. We had sent in members of the Ohio National Guard and had their protective suits on to measure the air. And no one went back within that area or was allowed back in that area until they could come back and tell us that the monitoring was consistently good. In fact, the monitoring showed that the air was basically what it was prior to the actual train crash, or what we would have expected it to be at that time. People were then let back in. Our environmental teams remain in East Palestine, where they're working directly with the railroad and others to ensure that the site is thoroughly cleaned up with no shortcuts. This morning, I called Alan Shaw, CEO of Norfolk Southern. He and I have had contact numerous times since the crash. I discussed with him many of the concerns that we're hearing from residents of East Palestine. I asked him directly if he would personally guarantee that the railroad would stay there until absolutely everything was cleaned up. He gave me his word and his commitment that the railroad would do that. They would not leave until that was done. I might also mention that I received a call from President Biden earlier last week He told me that he wanted just to assure me that anything I needed from the federal government, they would supply. And told me to call him personally if there was anything that we needed at any point. I told the President that I appreciated the work that we had received so far from the U.S. EPA. I also told him that I appreciated the help that the Defense Department gave the Ohio National Guard in regard to the modeling, that it was very, very helpful, and I expressed my gratitude for that. Let me also say that J.D. Vance and Congressman Johnson have been in touch with me. In fact, I just talked to both of them a moment ago again. They've expressed their interest in doing anything that needs to be done. I know Senator Brown has as well. And let me just now talk about something that I did learn today, which I think does impact Congress. I learned today from the PUCO, Ohio's PUCO, that this train was not considered high hazardous material train. Let me repeat this. This train apparently was not considered a high hazardous material train. Therefore, the railroad was not required to notify anyone here in Ohio about what was in the rail cars coming through our state. I would think that the members of Congress, and I would ask them to take a look at this, even though some rail cars did have hazardous material on board, and while most of them did not, that's why it was not categorized as a high hazardous material train. Frankly, if this is true, and I'm told it's true, this is absurd. And we need to look at this, and Congress needs to take a look at how these things are handled. We should know when we have trains carrying hazardous material that are going through the state of Ohio. So I ask Congress to take a look at this and again see what they can find out, and if those facts as I related them are true, to take the appropriate action. So let me now get down to sharing the information that we have. Let me just state again, we will continue to do this. We're not leaving either. We're not leaving at East Palestine until everything is done. And we have, as I indicated, a number of agencies from the state of Ohio that have been involved, and they will continue to be involved as we move forward. Let me now ask Mary Mertz, the Director of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, to come up. I think Steve Gray was going to come up as well, and discuss the question about the dead fish. I know that people have been seeing the dead fish. They want to know what is going on, whether that is continuing to be a problem. And I've asked the Director of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to talk about that and talk about some of the streams that are in fact impacted. From there, we will go, and I will introduce her in a moment, but a representative from the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency who will also talk about the water quality, and we'll move from there to the water and to the air. Director Mertz.
So I wanted to start off to give you just a little bit of context about the waterways we're talking about, where they are, and how the water flowed. So I think Steve's going to help me out here. So the initial water impact was at Sulphur Run. Are we able to? Can you find that on there, or do we need to use the map in your hand?
So it would be up here.
So above this map, but we have a smaller map here. The initial impact was at Sulphur Run, leading down into Leslie Run to Bull Creek, and then a portion of the North Fork of Beaver Creek.
Right.
So we essentially, for our purposes, we looked at 4 different waterways over a space of about 7.5 miles, and what the environmental impacts were on those streams and tributaries.
I mentioned, Director, what's beyond that as we move towards the Ohio River?
So the North Fork of Beaver Creek leads into Beaver Creek, which I'm lost. I mean, we eventually get down there.
To the Ohio River. So,
Yeah, the Beaver
Step
Creek
up
does
here,
go
Steve.
directly into the Ohio River. Yeah, go for it.
so the North Fork of Beaver Creek goes into the main stem of Little Beaver Creek, which is a state scenic river, and then that flows into the Ohio River.
So that's the essential geography we were looking at for this. And, the Department of Natural Resources, part of our mission is to preserve and improve Ohio's biodiversity. So our concern in this case was what was happening with the aquatic wildlife. And what we have discovered through the testing and sampling that's been done is that very early on, we have estimated, based on our sampling and modeling, about 3,500 dead fish across that space, across those streams, tributaries, waterways, 12 different species. The good news is that none of those species are threatened or endangered, but that is still a loss of wildlife, so of concern, especially when we reach the Beaver Creek, this state wild and scenic river, where we are especially protective of what we have there. So some of the species, creek chub, mottled sculpin, stone roller, I think we have some pictures somewhere of what those are, but 12 different species, none threatened or endangered, but still a loss of life all the same. The one species we will be looking for, we have no evidence yet that any have died, but this is really an area of focus for hellbenders, which are federal and state endangered. And so we will be doing some monitoring in the months to come to see if any of them did die in the initial release into the waterways. So good news, there doesn't appear to be any increase in the fish or aquatic creatures killed since the first couple days of the derailment. So wildlife officers have been there every day on the scene, working with contractors who are in the water, doing the net sampling, making the estimates, and we will continue to monitor and watch what's going on and eventually hold those responsible accountable for the loss of wildlife in the area. We don't have any evidence of non-aquatic species suffering from the derailment. Haven't had any concerns about that, not only here, but we also communicate with the Pennsylvania Game Commission as well, and they haven't heard about that either. So that is essentially where we are with the Department of Natural Resources, and I think the Governor.
Director, thank you. Thank you very much. She'll be available for questions. Let me invite now Tiffany Kavalak from the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency to come to the microphone. We have on the screen from East Palestine, Kurt Kohler. Kurt, you may remember at our previous two press conferences was available and discussed what the situation was. We're asking them to tell us the very latest measurements coming from the site.
Thank you, Governor. Hello, I'm Tiffany Kavalak. I'm the Chief of the Division of Surface Water at Ohio EPA. And speaking of the derailment on February 3rd, we speak that it occurred at the location of Sulphur Run. And Norfolk and Southern are actively aerating Sulphur Run and have containment within the 1.3 miles that Sulphur Run leads into Leslie Run. Sulphur Run remains contaminated, but we're confident that it is contained. Data from February 4th, the day after the train derailment, down gradient on Leslie Run and North Fork Little Beaver Creek showed very low detection levels of contaminants and mostly from fire residual chemicals. Data from February 10th, more recently, showed low levels of only two contaminants, butyl acrylate and ethyl hexyl acrylate. Both are volatile organic chemicals in Leslie Run, the one that's directly below Sulphur Run. The butyl acrylate dissipates to non-detectable levels once it gets to the North Fork of the Little Beaver Creek. And the other one, ethyl hexyl acrylate, dissipates to non-detectable levels once we get to Little Beaver Creek. We have not detected any vinyl chloride in any of the down gradient waterways. Both the February 4th and the February 10th data are available now on Ohio EPA's website that's titled East Palestine's Train Derailment. The spill did flow to the Ohio River during that initial slug, but the Ohio River is very large, and it's a water body that's able to dilute the pollutants pretty quickly. Ohio EPA and other state agencies have been working with the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission, some may know as ORSANCO, to track the contaminant plume in real time. It's moving at about a mile an hour. ORSANCO's tracking allows for potential closing of drinking water intakes to allow the majority of the chemicals to pass. This strategy, along with drinking water treatment like oxidation and advanced treatment like activated carbon, are both effective at addressing these contaminants and helps ensure the safety of the drinking water supplies. So we're pretty confident that these low levels are not getting passed on to the customers. Would you like me to pass it to Kurt?
Let me ask you one question.
Yes.
You might explain. You talked about the containment. What steps were taken to contain it in that initial spill area?
Yes, and I think that's why we have. I think Kurt
Okay,
can.
Kurt, do that.
Yes.
Okay, good. Kurt. You want to answer that, Kurt, and then you can kind of give us a report from East Palestine.
Not only with multiple containment points and in-situ treatment in Sulphur Run, working with Norfolk Southern and our other partners, kind of as a management plan for this cleanup, under, again, the emergency phase, where we targeted 3 sites, or we used 3 different names for it. We have the wreckage area, where the cars are still being staged. We have Pleasant Road, where we do know we have gross contamination present on the ground and still in the 2 ditches. And we have the waterways. The waterways have been our targeted and our concern from the onset of this. We did get initial data, dirt dumped into the creek to stop the flow, or the booms, the oil containment booms, to stop the floating product. From that point in time, we did use very tried and true methods, but we've been able to build those up. Aeration and sparging units that increase the efficiency of the breaking down of the dissolved phase of the contaminants present. We do, again, Sulphur Run, we have a containment. It is our control area. We're confident that the materials getting out of there and the extending down in the Leslie Run are good. There is residual material in Leslie Run. That's some of the explanation why there is still some of the detections. We do have aeration in Leslie Run. Back into the site, like at Pleasant Road, where the butyl car did release material along with the vinyl chloride burn areas, there has been active excavation of those grossly contaminated soil minerals. 2 ditches that run parallel to the tracks, North Ditch and South Ditch, which both drain into Sulphur Run, have been blocked off. The water that naturally flows in there from the wetland is being pumped around so we don't augment any contamination and continue to push high levels of contaminants downstream. And then excavation of that material has already begun. The center line of the track where butyl acrylate was puddled along with vinyl chloride residues is actively being excavated. It is a constant source reduction, again, with the target of moving over into the remediation phase. We're trying to get rid of, again, the high-level gross contamination. Ohio EPA's emergency response, along with other support from our multiple divisions, have boots on the ground all day, every day since the onset of this incident. I'm confident that we'll get it to a stage where it's safe to transfer over for remediation.
Kurt, thank you very much. Let me ask you one question, and then if you'll stay around, because the media may have some questions for you when we finish. How far along is this removal of dirt? My understanding is they're going down 1 to 3 feet down into the ground, but how far along are they in regard to that?
Current volumes, we have about almost 1 million gallons of water collected and stored in various storage containers on site from a liquid waste standpoint. And then from the solids, if I remember, there's almost 500 cubic yards of vinyl chloride impacted material. That center line of track is, again, emergency response. We do that, there was awareness that there was material on the surface and extending down. The goal of this was to get rid of that highly contaminated, potentially mobile material before we had rain events or something like that could drive it further down. This initial phase, some of these pits, sir, are now 700 feet long and about 8 foot deep in some areas. And this main excavation going now there's some stability issues. So I think they're reporting about 4 to 5 feet below ground surface down to a hard packed clay. And that is going to all the way from Pleasant Road into where the main derailment occurred. So it'll in the range of 1,000 foot or more.
Do you have any idea what percentage of the work is done yet, roughly?
From the emergency response phase, that's something we're working. We still have our action items, the ditches, the center line. Again, the waterway is primary. It's moving along. I would hope next week a lot of the emergency response phases, high-end daily activities should start to drop off.
Kurt, thank you. Stay on there in case we get questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Appreciate the work you're doing. Let me now introduce Dr. Bruce Vanderhoff, the director of the Ohio Department of Health. He's going to talk about exactly where we are in regard to the air, the water, and everything from the public health point of view. And Dr. Vanderhoff, one of the things I would ask you to address is the odor. I know people are still smelling an odor, and I wonder if you can comment about that and what the significance of that is.
Well, thank you, Governor. Let's begin by just talking about the chemicals. And the fact is that, for the most part, most of the chemicals that we're worried about and that we're talking about fall into a category known as volatile organic chemicals. And you heard that mentioned before, or compounds. Now, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, it's important for us to recognize, are actually a part of our everyday life. So if you go this afternoon on your way home to pump gas in your car, you're being exposed to volatile organic compounds. You are. If you are burning wood or natural gas in your home, you're being exposed. And certainly, if you are smoking or you live with someone who smokes, you're being exposed to actually fairly substantial levels of volatile organic compounds. Now, the good news is that most people can be around these volatile organic compounds at low levels without really feeling health effects. However, at higher levels, especially over a longer period of time, then we can have longer-term health effects. And that's why there is the concern around these compounds. So the goal from a health point of view in a situation like this is really to make every effort we can to reduce the risk that we're going to take those volatile organic compounds into our bodies. And there are really two paths for that to happen. One is what we breathe, and the other is what we consume. So the effort, as you heard it described, really began at the start with trying to make sure that we had a safe environment as it related to the air that people were breathing. For us, as human beings, we've got to breathe. We can't avoid the air. The air is there. We need it, and so it has to be clean. It has to be safe for us. And the good news is, and you heard the governor describe this, by the time we were at the decision point for potentially bringing the people who had evacuated back into the impacted area, we had on hand air testing that told us that the air really looked pretty much like it did before this event ever happened. So that gave us really great confidence when it came to that aspect. But, you know, then there's the second aspect. Even after bringing people back, we made it clear that, hey, the next piece of this is your water source. We want to test that. Now, the good news is the majority of people who live in the East Palestine community are, in fact, on municipal water, and those municipal sources are deep wells that they were able to intentionally reserve using the most distant ones only for feeding the water supply. But nevertheless, there are quite a number of people who are on private water systems, mostly private wells. We have strongly encouraged all of those people on private wells to get their wells tested, and that will be done at no cost to them. This is something that is part of the remediation, and it's very important for the reasons I just described. Now, if you are one of the people who live in the impacted area and have a private water source, you're not on municipal water, I'd encourage you to call a number. I'll read the number out. You've heard it before. It's 330-849-3919. And indicate, I believe I'm in the affected area, and I'd like to have my water source checked. Now, we're strongly recommending those who have not yet had their water source checked to use bottled water. Bottled water is being made available again. Same phone number that you can call if you need access to that. This is going to be particularly important if you are pregnant, if you are breastfeeding, or if you are preparing formula for an infant. So we would encourage you to avail yourself of that water. The bottom line is that from the very start of this, we have taken every step possible to assure that people's safety was first and foremost. And that with the compounds that we're talking about, in consultation with experts at the national level, we have first made sure that we were providing a clean atmosphere, clean air, and now we are actively working to assure that people, for the long run, have clean water. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you very much. We're happy to take any questions for anyone who's
Please use the microphone if you have a question.
Hi, Joe Ingalls with Ohio Public Radio and Television. My question is, you said that the water is safe, at least the community water that's been tested, but should people maybe think of using water filters like Brita filters, that kind of thing? Is that a good thing to do right now while things are unknown? And should people just go ahead and do bottled water in the meantime?
Yeah, at this stage in the game, we are recommending that people in the community consider using bottled water. We are awaiting results of testing of the municipal water sources that are going to be fairly detailed and will allow us to have a very complete look at the potential compounds that could be involved, and we expect that very soon. You know, from my point of view, using bottled water for a short period of time is pretty easy to do. And once we have data and information, especially if you have a private water source, look, there are things that we will be able to do. It may be drilling a new well, a deep well instead of a shallow well. It may be using some of the remediation tools that were described for municipal sources that include forms of aeration and charcoal filtering, et cetera. So for right now, I think bottled water is the right answer.
Hi, this is Ashley Bornanson with WBNS. I also have a question for you, Doctor. In terms of that radius of those who should be drinking bottled water, how far does that radius go? Could this impact Central Ohioans? And what could that impact be on the current health of those who might have been intaking this water?
Thank you. So we're very confident about, and there are maps in the that are available in the community of what we believe to be the impacted zone for these wells. And if people call that hotline, they'll be able to access that. For people more distant, I'm going to turn to some of my colleagues from the Ohio EPA to describe again that process of testing. If you're in Central Ohio, this is really not relevant to your water source. If you're actually in most of the rest of Ohio, we're really talking about those who have municipal water sources coming off of the Ohio River, and I'm absolutely confident that Orsenco and the local communities, along with Ohio EPA and US EPA, are using every appropriate caution to assure that there's no public health impact.
We'll do the Ohio River again.
Sure.
It's important.
Yes, it is important. We know that there is a plume moving down the Ohio River, so all of our neighboring states, state departments, and Orsenco are in constant communication about the location of the plume. We think it's on its way around Huntsville or Huntington, West Virginia now, and so all of those water systems are in constant communication on when it may be at their intake, and they're either shutting down and or using the treatment available that they have on site. So we think that's the only southern part of the exposure that there might be from the site.
For that second part, could there be any health effects of those who have already intaken that water?
We're seeing very low levels of contaminants, and so all of the treatment being done at those water systems take out any contamination before it finished water. So I can't envision that there would be any risk that has already occurred from the drinking water systems on the Ohio River.
I have questions about water as well. So, I'm Nick Evans with the Ohio Capital Journal. I just want to make sure that I understand what you laid out. Okay, so it goes Sulphur Run, Leslie Run, Beaver Creek, Ohio River, correct?
North Fork.
North Fork, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So you said that sulfur is contaminated, but you think it's contained. Leslie, no vinyl chloride, but ethyl butyl and ethyl hexyl?
Acrylate.
Okay.
Yes.
What's in the plume?
That was the initial slug that we talked about that were the fire combustion chemicals that we detected that are showing up. We have data that's on we showed hundreds of detections on that initial slug that went through into the Ohio River, but they're no longer being seen in the smaller tributaries except for those two chemicals.
Okay, so in the plume, though, it's just the ethyl hexyl and the...
In the Ohio River?
Yeah.
Honestly, there's probably, it's the fire contaminant combustion materials. It's not free product per se. Volatile organic compounds, there could be multiple, but not necessarily just the remaining two that we're seeing in the smaller tributaries, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You want to talk about the dilution at that point? In the Ohio River, what are you seeing in the Ohio River?
So very, very low levels of volatile organic compounds in the Ohio River itself. Probably it helps that it has been very diluted, and we don't expect any higher concentrations to follow than the initial onset of the plume that we're tracking.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Follow up on the plume. When you mentioned the fire combustion materials, are there concerns about PFAS and similar contamination?
So we have not yet tested for the PFAS compounds. We are working with the local EMA to start testing the PFAS compounds, I think, in the drinking water specifically.
Hi, Jeremy Pelzer with Cleveland.com. There have been anecdotal reports in the media of people around East Palestine suffering headaches, other health problems like sore throat, etc. And then in addition, other anecdotal reports about animals dying like chickens and cats. Have you been able to substantiate any of these? And what do you think, if these are true, are causing these?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. Anecdotes are challenging because they are anecdotes. A couple of things. First of all, for many of the compounds that go on the list of volatile organic compounds, we can smell them at levels that are well below the levels that are considered unsafe. So it is possible that at a very, very low level, you can still smell a volatile organic compound. So I don't discount that. In terms of some of the symptoms of headache, et cetera, unfortunately, volatile organic compounds share with a host of other things the ability to cause very common symptoms at the lower levels. So headache, eye irritation, nose irritation, et cetera. I think that we have to look at the measured facts. And the measured facts include the fact that the air sampling in that area really is not pointing toward an air source for this. And secondly, in terms of water, we're encouraging people to use bottled water, particularly if they're on a private water source. Now, could somebody have a private water source that could be contaminated and we haven't tested it yet? Well, it's a voluntary program, and that is possible. I would encourage them to make a switch immediately. Remember, with these compounds, it's not, in most circumstances, just about a single small exposure. It's an equation of concentration over duration. The higher the concentration, the longer the duration, the greater the risk. Everything that we've gathered thus far is really pointing toward very